Hi, Ted Morsey here. I want to make a video about a writing topic that is, I think, very important and one that I've talked about before, I think, in other videos and on my podcast that I co-host. And certainly with students, I've had several exchanges over the years. But because of a recent exchange, I thought maybe I would make a video in particular about this topic. And so here I am. All right. So I had an experience where a student expressed some frustration because they had the idea, like the start of a short story, pretty clearly in mind, and they had the end of the story clearly in mind. So all they had to do was write the stuff in the middle, and they were going to have themselves a pretty fine story. But they discovered that when they did that, the story was kind of boring or dull, or it just didn't really meet their expectations. They thought they were going to have this really powerful piece of writing, and it turned out to be pretty whatever. And I said, I think the problem may have been that you had what you felt was the end of the story before you ever started. So that's what I want to talk about. The difference between sort of planning something ahead of time versus sort of discovering it as you write. Now, I'm going to mainly focus on writing fiction, so particularly short stories, novels, that sort of thing. But I do think it applies to basically all kinds of writing, and so I'll speak to that a little bit as well. And I want to, for one thing, refer to this guy, William H. Gass, who, as you may know, is my literary idol, and I refer to Gass all the time. And before I do that, though, let me give you a little backstory here. So when I was just kind of learning the craft, and I had written some short stories, but I wanted to graduate to being a novelist. And so I was taking, a master's degree program in creative writing and so forth. And my mentor was the novelist Kent Haruf. And he was really good friends with this dude, John Irving. In fact, they went through University of Iowa Writers Workshop together, and they kept in close contact afterward and were really good friends. Unfortunately, Kent passed away, a decade ago or more. But when I was taking my courses and when I was working with Kent, he not only, would share his insights about writing, but also John Irving's insights, because again, they were communicating all the time, and they'd gone to school together and so on. And John Irving had been a really one of my favorites long before that whole experience, so I was super excited to be getting sort of, at least indirectly, some words of wisdom from John Irving on a regular basis. You can see The Water Method, man. I used to say this was my favorite book, and I'm still pretty darn fond of it. And you can see I've read it many times. But I bring that duo up, Kent Haruf and John Irving, because they were of a similar mind in the sense that Kent was very much a planner. When he had a novel in mind, he would plan it out before really writing it. Just a chapter by chapter outline. Exactly what was going to happen in each chapter, what characters were going to be introduced, what action was going to take place, etc., etc. So when he would start writing, chapter one, he already kind of knew the whole story. Now, he would say that he was open to changes, because as you got into it, some things you thought were going to work well maybe don't work as well in the in execution. So he certainly was open to change, but he definitely had in mind the whole enchilada from chapter one to chapter whatever of the entire book. Similarly, he said, and I've read this elsewhere, so it wasn't just Kent, but he said that John Irving always had the end of the novel in mind first, because he felt like, how can you write the thing unless you know where it's going? Kind of makes sense. And so he would have the end of the novel in mind first, and then he'd kind of figure out how to work his way to that point, right? And so, again, I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd never written a novel, or at least never finished a novel. And so here these accomplished writers, including one who had kind of become my mentor, my main writing teacher, were very much about planning. So I thought, well, that's how you do it apparently. So I tried to do it that way. I tried to come up with, an outline like Kent Haruf used. I tried to think of the ending first, like John Irving, and it just did not work for me. I don't know. It just didn't jibe in the way my brain works. And so I was always much more of a fly by the seat of my pants, right by the seat of my pants kind of guy, not really sure where I was going. And I thought I was doing it wrong. But then eventually I came to realize that there are just different ways of doing it. And I've kind of thought over the years, the decades, that writers tend to fall in one of two camps. They either are kind of planners, outliners, kind of know where they're going ahead of time, versus the rest of us who are, again, right by the seat of our pants. Writing is a process of discovery, and so on. Fast forward from the Kent Haruf days, and I discovered this dude, William H. Gass. And I immediately just embraced Gass wholeheartedly. And it wasn't because he really opened my eyes necessarily to a lot of new things. He did do that, in some ways, but also he confirmed in a lot of ways ideas and opinions I'd had about writing and about art and teaching and all kinds of things. And he was, well respected and so forth. And so it kind of validated in some ways my own ideas. And I discovered Gass was very much a right by the seat of your pants kind of guy. And I want to turn in particular to a quote from Gass that is from an interview in 1976 with Thomas LeClaire. And they're talking about one of Gass's earliest publications, the novella The Peterson Kid, which was collected in the Heart of the Country and Other Stories, although it's really more of a novella. And it was originally published by John Gardner in his literary journal. In fact, Gass had spent a decade trying to find someone to publish The Peterson Kid and was very frustrated by the fact that no one would take it. And then John Gardner contacted him. He was starting a new journal. They didn't know each other at that time. This is their first contact, and so he ended up publishing The Peterson Kid. But the interview then, that was in the early 60s, by the way, 1961, I think. And so this is, quite a while later, but LeClaire is asking him about The Peterson Kid. And Gass says this. Let's kind of go back a little before the meat of the quote I want to get to. He says, I used to collect names as possibilities. Certain characters, in a sense, emerge from their names. I never conceive a character and then seek to christen it. I always have to have the words. I can't even get a story going until I have the title. The title, though, is a direct statement of the central image. This is the key part that I want to get to. If I try to think out and outline some linear structure, then I start pushing my material in that direction like a baby in a tram. When you arrive at your destination, all you still have is a baby in a tram. I want the work to write itself, every passage to emerge from the ones which have come before. So I have to keep looking at what I've done to see what will come out. Usually nothing does, and I have to rewrite my beginning until something does suggest itself. But again, let me go back. If you try to think out and outline some linear structure, then I start pushing my material in that direction like a baby in a tram, and when you arrive at your destination, all you still have is a baby in a tram. I want the work to write itself. I think that's really important, that what Gass is saying there is that writing, maybe particularly writing fiction, is an organic process, and you don't know what's going to happen on the page until you get in there and start writing. And I think that's really key. I think that you have to be in a position where your characters can surprise you, and you're not sure where they're going. And I think that if you can get into that zone where your characters are kind of behaving of their own accord, and you're not sure where you're going, and you're not sure what the ending is going to be until suddenly you arrive there, then that surprise, that excitement of discovery comes through on the page and eventually is communicated to the reader. And so my student, who was disappointed because they'd written this story, but it really didn't have much life to it, much energy, certainly nothing surprising to it, that was because they weren't surprised by the story as they were writing it, because they knew where it was headed all along. And again, there are writers who apparently can do that. They can know where they're headed, but yet they have the talent and the ability to still make the work interesting and exciting and surprising and all those kinds of things. As I was kind of pondering all this, I saw this quote on Blue Sky, and it's from Robert Frost, and it definitely speaks to this topic here. And Frost said, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. No surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader." And again, I had been thinking along these lines before I saw that quote, so it was sort of serendipitous. But again, this idea that if your work, whether it's a story, a novel, or a poem, or creative nonfiction, or a script, or whatever it is, if it isn't exciting you, if it isn't surprising you, if it isn't eliciting strong emotions in you, it's unlikely it's going to then ultimately communicate all of that to the reader, the viewer, the listener, whatever you want to say. So there has to be an element of surprise. So yeah, you may have a general sense of where a story, let's say, or a novel, or whatever it is, may be going, but I think you have to really be open to letting the work kind of take the wheel and seeing where it wants to take itself, right? What do the characters want to do? What is their motivation, right? And again, it applies really, I think, to any kind of writing. I'm mainly a novelist, but I've been working on a set of sonnets, a sequence of sonnets for the last couple of months, and I'm writing a biography of Mary Shelley via sonnets. And so the overall work has a sort of narrative arc to it, according to the narrative arc of her life. But each individual sonnet, and I'm using kind of a loosely Petrarchan form. It's Petrarchan in the octave, volta, sestet structure, but in terms of line length and syllables and all that, it's pretty free going. But my process is I get an idea for a sonnet and I kind of free write, almost in prose, well, not almost, really in prose, what will become ultimately the octave, the opening kind of 8 lines. And then once I have a sense of the shift, the volta, then I kind of free write more or less the sestet, what will ultimately be the final 6 lines that respond to those 8 lines. But I just kind of have some ideas. I'm not really quite sure what it's all about. And that doesn't really come until then I turn to my laptop and I start trying to manipulate the octave part into an actual octave of 8 lines with some pretty regular line length, not too rigid in that regard. And then, kind of turn and work on the sestet, which again, I kind of have an idea how that responds to the octave, but not really, not solidly until I get in there. And I certainly don't know how the sonnet is going to end. And usually it's those last couple of lines that I'm trying to squeeze into the sestet, the 6-line ending, is where it's really challenging. And I'm really kind of looking for the sonnet to tell me how it wants to end, right? And so I think that's a really important lesson. Let the writing kind of write itself, as Gass said way back in 1976. And I think that this is true of all creative work. And I think it also has to do with a phenomenon I've noticed with creative nonfiction, especially as it's being written by a lot of student writers, newer writers, is that, as I sometimes put it, is they kind of forget about the first part. They forget about the creative part of creative nonfiction, and it's really more just kind of straight reportage. Just this is what happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and it might be about a very emotional, very exciting, very traumatic event that they experienced. But oftentimes that high level of emotion just doesn't come through, and it reads like a police report or something, and not like a really engaging, work of literary art of some sort. And I think, again, maybe what part of the problem is there when that happens is that they've got an idea for this creative nonfiction essay, let's say, or a piece of memoir, whatever it is, and they know ahead of time what happened to them, how they felt about it. They feel like they know what they learned from it, maybe what others might take away from it. And so they've got all of that in mind as they go into just sort of relaying the event, right? But then again, there's no excitement, there's no surprise. I think that nonfiction writers, essayists, memoirists, who are writing in a way of sort of self-exploration, they're not sure what the event meant. They're not sure how it affected them. They're not sure what life lessons they could possibly draw from it. And so their writing of the piece is a sort of self-exploration. And they surprise themselves. They discover responses to the events that they had not really registered at the time. I mean, maybe sort of unconsciously they seem to be behaving in certain kinds of ways. And I think those kinds of creative nonfiction pieces, especially if they remember the creative part, can be really revelatory, not just for the writer, but then for anybody who reads that piece. So I think life can be injected into even something that's a true event, recorded factually, accurately, if in the beginning the writer is writing it not simply to say kind of basically what happened, but to try to kind of figure out what happened and how they felt about it and how it may have impacted them and so forth, right? So that's the bottom line here. Yes, maybe you're a planner, an outliner like Kent Haruf, maybe you're even like John Irving, that you need to know the ending before you can even start the darn thing. And if that works for you, fantastic. But I think for a lot of us, it doesn't work. And if you're having some frustration because your stories, your poems, your essays, etc., are coming out kind of lifeless and just sort of DOA, it may be because you have too solid of a mind what you think you want them to be, and you're just sort of making it happen, pushing them in that direction, as Gass would say. You need to lighten up and let the piece sort of breathe and tell you what it wants to be. Let your characters speak to you and surprise you, bring you to tears, bring you to laughter, and that's a much, much more likely event than that you will have all those kind of emotions in your reader, right? Stop right there and let you ponder all of that.